Thanks everybody for coming out on this relatively warm day. My name is Ben Hale. I'm the interim director of the Benson Center and a faculty member here at the university. Let me just introduce our two speakers. We have two today. They're going to be debating, though not in a classic debate format. First, we're going to be hearing from Larry Temkin, who is a professor at Rutgers University, philosopher working in normative ethics and political philosophy. He got his BA from the University of Wisconsin-Madison and his PhD from Princeton University, where he was fortunate to study under Derek Parfit. He started his career, I believe, at Rice University and then moved to Rutgers in 2000. We are also going to be hearing from Jason Brennan, who is a philosopher and business professor. He's the Robert J. and Elizabeth Flanagan Family Professor of Strategy, Economics, Ethics, and Public Policy at the McDonough School of Business at Georgetown University. He did his PhD at the University of Arizona, I think working with David Schmitz, is that correct? He's written an enormous number of books for a young scholar of his age. He wrote books titled Markets Without Limits, which he co-authored with Peter Jaworski, Compulsory Voting, Why Not Capitalism, Libertarianism, What Everyone Needs to Know, The Ethics of Voting, and others. So I'll let them sort of introduce themselves to you by way of their arguments, but please join me in welcoming our two speakers.
So now I feel like I should say, hey, I've written a couple of books too, and makes it sound like he's written all these books, and who's this other guy coming up here? Why is he even bothering to talk to us today? Yeah, I guess. All right, so anyway, thanks, Ben, for that terrible introduction. I'm delighted to be here in Colorado, where the phrase Rocky Mountain High no longer refers to the altitude, and the smog that used to engulf Denver has now been replaced by a blue haze covering the entire state. Thanks to each of you for being here, the debate's co-sponsors, and to all those who helped organize this event. This year and last, it was originally scheduled to be last year, but unfortunately my back went out. I wasn't able to make it. We rescheduled, so I'm glad to be here. But Bob Pasnow, Matthias Stoip, Ben Hale, Alistair Norcross, Lily Welsh, Jason Brennan, and especially Betty Kilstock. I'm going first today because I don't have pretty pictures. I just talk, and you have to listen, and that's hard. And he does have pretty pictures, so after you've done the hard work, then you can sit back and relax and enjoy what he's doing. But until then, you have to work. Maybe you have to work for him, too. I hope you have a handout, because actually you don't need that handout. It's just something to doodle on. Part 1, introduction. I begin with some clarificatory remarks. First, my aim here is to highlight capitalism's bad and ugly side. That's what I was assigned to do. In fact, I believe that any one-sided assessment of capitalism is certain to be mistaken, deeply misguided, and possibly dangerous. My view is that there's much to be said in capitalism's favor, and that suitably constrained, capitalism's benefits could be vastly greater or more widespread. Unfortunately, such constraints do not yet exist, and without them, capitalism's impact is deeply problematic. Second, in this talk, I will use the words capitalism, free market, and free enterprise interchangeably. That's dangerous, but I'm going to do it for a 30-minute talk. Also, our talk tonight is to talk about what's good about capitalism as it actually operates in the world. Hence, my concern is with real-world capitalism, replete with both national and international regulatory capture, that reflects the outsized interests of incredibly powerful actors. Accordingly, I'm focusing on the down and dirty version of capitalism that exists in the US today and that dominates the global market. Here, the economic and political systems of capitalism and democracy are so deeply entwined that the shortcomings of the one are difficult to disentangle from the shortcomings of the other. So I'll lump them together, even though in theory these are separable. Third, this talk exemplifies Mark Twain's remark that the difference between a man and a dog is that a dog won't bite the hand that feeds him. I own a nice house and a fancy car, and I've eaten at obscenely priced restaurants, and I've traveled to places like the pyramids, the Taj Mahal, and Antarctica. Capitalism made all this possible, for which I am deeply grateful. Yet I'm acutely aware that many others have not similarly benefited from capitalism. It's with them in mind that I deliver my remarks. Now, our question tonight is not whether I'm a hypocrite for criticizing capitalism without forsaking its benefits, but whether my concerns are true. If they are, then there's strong reason to modify capitalism to maximize its benefits while minimizing its harms. Fourth, as with people, often an economic system is its greatest strengths. An economic system's greatest strengths are also its greatest weaknesses. Accordingly, I shall suggest that some of capitalism's features are both to be loved and hated. Part 2, serving the God of freedom. Nobel laureate Milton Friedman, one of free enterprise's foremost defenders, once claimed that we could serve only one God, and that God is Friedman. Just kidding. What he actually said was that we could serve only one God, and that God is freedom. For Friedman, capitalism's great virtue was that it enhances the most important ideal, namely freedom. And he thought that when our ideals conflict, we must never sacrifice the most important ideal on the altar of a less important ideal. Friedman is not alone in his monistic approach. People often address issues in terms of whatever ideal they value most. Unfortunately, this approach is deeply mistaken. The truth about morality is extremely complex, and there isn't just one thing that matters. Hence, what we need in thinking about important issues are not simple, pat answers, but careful, thoughtful, subtle consideration of all the relevant factors. That is, we need to think about issues pluralistically, asking such questions as, what ought I to do? What sort of person ought I to be? And what makes one outcome better or worse than another? In addressing such questions, we must give due weight to every factor that matters and rid ourselves of the simple-minded and deeply mistaken view that the smallest gain along one dimension might outweigh large losses among many dimensions. Freedom matters. It matters a lot. But those who defend capitalism in the name of freedom need to remember the haunting words of Mademoiselle Roland as she was led to the guillotine. O liberty, what crimes are committed in thy name? Whether or not capitalism gets high marks for promoting freedom, unless it also promotes justice, equality, perfection, utility, compassion, kindness, sympathy, and generosity, then there's powerful reason to either reject it or improve it or supplement it. Part 3, business is business. The expression business is business and caveat the expressions business is business and caveat emptor, buyer beware, convey capitalist society's widely assumed view that when you enter the business world, you leave your scruples, which is to say your morals, at the door. So does Tassio's remark at the end of The Godfather, explaining his betrayal of the family. Tell Mike it was only business. I always liked him. Sadly, nobody expects our business leaders to be choir boys or Boy Scouts. Rather, we expect them to be like Gordon Gekko in the 1987 film Wall Street, who claimed that greed is good. Greed is right. Greed works. Gekko's claim is shocking precisely because he says out loud what others merely think. In doing so, he expresses the substantive normative view that under capitalism, greed is a virtue. This is a striking view, given that greed is in tension with the virtues of sympathy, kindness, compassion, and generosity, and has long been regarded as one of the 7 deadly sins. Arguably then, capitalism's ethos separates the question of what is good for business from the question of what is good morally. Still, this does not mean that capitalism is entitled to use the get-out-of-jail-free card that it has printed for itself. In assessing its merits, we must consider whether capitalism, with its focus on maximizing profits, leads us to act rightly, promotes virtue, and produces the best overall outcome. Of course, some defenders of the greed is good mantra appeal to the invisible hand of fate view attributed to Adam Smith, according to which everyone acts in their own best interest, that will be best for everyone. But that view is a myth that not even Smith accepted as a general truth under capitalism. Part 4, from the highest mountains to the deepest valleys. We live in an amazing age. Things that would have been regarded as pipe dreams or even miracles a scant 50 or 100 years ago are now mundane, everyday realities. Transcontinental air flights, computers, cell phones, the internet, and so on. I once owned a 198K floppy disk that had greater memory power than the entire 5 floors of the Pentagon's computer banks of the 1950s. Today, a 93-gram, 2-gigabyte flash drive, old hat. Advances in medicine are no less breathtaking. Entire diseases have been wiped out, and crippling maladies are now treatable. Triple bypass surgeries are now routine, as are kidney, liver, and even artificial heart transplants. Moreover, we can now improve the human condition itself via a wide range of pharmacological and genetic enhancements. Globally, the last 60 years have seen substantial increases in literacy and life expectancy, coupled with substantial decreases in birth rates and infant mortality. This is all extremely good. And although the pathways are often obscure, indirect, and incredibly complex, surely much of this progress is due to the rise of global capitalism. Such progress, and its genuine progress, is a strong reason to love capitalism's impact on our world. But if, as the world's dominant economic system, capitalism rightly deserves credit for many global advances, as I think it does, it also deserves blame for some of our world's saddest features. For example, 1. Far more people died from hunger and remediable diseases in the 20 years from 1990 to 2010. Some 360 million people than died in the whole of the 20th century from wars and repressive regimes. Some 200 million people. 2. More than 1.3 billion people live in extreme poverty on less than $1.25 a day. And more than 3 billion people live on less than $2.50 a day. 3. 2014, about 22,000 children died each day due to poverty-related causes. 4. In 2013, the world's wealthiest countries possessed 76% of the world's gross domestic product, or GDP, but less than 14% of the world's population. And the world's 500 billionaires possess more than twice as much of the world's GDP as the 2.4 billion members of the world's low-income countries combined. 5. Indeed, the world's 7 richest people possess more of the world's GDP than all 567 million people of the world's poorest 41 countries. Here, too, the causal pathways between capitalism and such facts are often obscure, indirect, and incredibly complex. But surely they are partly due to the nature and impact of global capitalism. Due to time constraints, let me simply note 3 points. First, capitalism produced much of the vast wealth creation of the last 60 years, which is a very good thing. But under capitalism, much of that wealth accrued to the world's wealthiest people. And that, I believe, is a very bad thing. Second, given its underlying profit motive, capitalism provides great incentives to efficiently provide for any desires that people can pay for, but little or no incentive to address the needs of the world's poor. Thus, capitalism's nature doesn't easily lend itself to being part of the solution to global poverty. And as the old saying goes, if you're not part of the solution, you're part of the problem. Third, many social scientists have commented on the so-called resource curse, which helps explain why civil wars and corrupt despots often arise in resource-rich countries, leaving a trail of rape, torture, murder, sickness, abject poverty, and a host of human rights violations in their wake. Leif Wadar of the London School of Economics illuminates this phenomenon in his powerful book, Blood Oil: Tyrants, Violence, and the Rules That Run the World. Wadar describes the, quote, surprising international rule, end quote, that connects despots in resource-cursed countries to wealthy consumers. That is, you and me. As Wadar puts it, quote, this legal rule, called effectiveness, means that might makes right. It says that coercive control over a population, might, results in legal control over that population's resources, right. The alchemy of effectiveness transmutes the iron of coercion into the gold of legal title. Whoever can gain coercive control sends resources down through the chains, sales change to consumers. And consumers' cash flows back up to the coercive actors to help them maintain their power. Effectiveness puts consumers, you and me, into business with bad actors abroad. End quote, except for the you and me, that was me. Well, who made effectiveness a rule of international trade? Basically, the world's richest countries, acting on behalf of both powerful multinational corporations and on behalf of their citizens, to whose standards of living the rule of effectiveness significantly contributes. Unfortunately, such gains for the world's best off, you and me, come at the expense of the victims of those corrupt despots who achieve and retain power in part because of the rule of effectiveness. This, too, is a reason to hate capitalism. Part 4. Freedom, autonomy, and human flourishing. Marx's slogan, from each according to his abilities to each according to his needs, raises many worries. We want to choose for ourselves which talents to develop and which jobs will be rewarding for us. Moreover, we want to reap the benefit of our labor, spending our earnings on whatever our heart's desires. We don't want some state, or God forbid, some philosopher king, some Larry Temkin, making such important decisions for us. Nor do we want someone else deciding which of our desires are genuine needs and which merit fulfilling, given the needs of others. We don't merely want to live, we want to dream big and to flourish. To paraphrase Dylan's Hooker in the Memphis Blues again, Marxism just knows what you need, but capitalism knows what you want. Capitalism holds out the promise of meeting those deep-seated concerns about freedom, autonomy, and human flourishing. And for millions, it has delivered on that promise. This, too, is something to love about capitalism. Yet the value of freedom, autonomy, and human flourishing lies not merely in the ability to dream big. Hey, Wendy, good to see you. But in the power to effectively pursue a life plan of your own choosing. And the sad reality is that under capitalism, this power is severely limited for much of the world. Capitalism richly rewards those with high demand talents. Doctors, lawyers, athletes, entrepreneurs, and so on. But it offers precious little to those lacking marketable talents or the opportunities to develop them. Overwhelmingly, this includes the young, aged, sick, poor, illiterate, and handicapped. Under capitalism, the state doesn't dictate which talents you develop, what job you do, how you spend your money, or which of your desires are met. But to a large extent, the market does. And the stark reality is that under capitalism, most of the world's 3 billion poverty-stricken people are stuck with severely limited prospects. As for the goal of human flourishing, for much of the world, the claim that capitalism allows for far more than satisfying your basic human needs is little more than a cruel taunt. That capitalism allows some to truly flourish and satisfy their wildest dreams is little consolation to the billions that capitalism has left behind. In terms of meaningful freedom, autonomy, and human flourishing, capitalism is a mixed bag. There's reason to love it on behalf of its winners. But there's also reason to hate it on behalf of its losers. Part 5. Amazon, impartiality, and the color of green. Here's another reason to love capitalism. Amazon. Hooking me up with a global network of producers and sellers, Amazon provides me with virtually any product my heart desires, quickly, efficiently, and cheaply. Moreover, it even anticipates my unknown desires, enabling me to satisfy those as well, all at the click of a button. For example, I recently went online to buy sparklers and candles for my daughter's wedding. I found them for an unbelievably low price. No doubt from the other side of the world. Before checking out, Amazon suggested, very gently, buying 500 silk rose petals to scatter on the tables. Available in dozens of colors to match any linens, and all for the low price of $2.99. What a deal! Hadn't even entered my mind to buy silk rose petals, but for $3 a package, I bought 2. And here's another point. Amazon satisfied my desires regardless of my race, gender, sexual orientation, nationality, or religion. Or whether I was beautiful or ugly, strong or weak, tall or short, sick or healthy, smart or dumb, able-bodied or handicapped. All Amazon cared about was that my money was green. Or, more accurately, that my credit card numbers checked out. This impartiality is capitalism at its best. Yet Amazon has come under scrutiny as well, as you all know, for its treatment of workers, monopolizing markets, privacy concerns, outsourcing jobs, and its impact on mom and pop businesses, brick and mortar stores, and Main Street America. Amazon embodies capitalism's ethos, perhaps as well as any company ever has. For the sake of profits, it gives its customers what they want. But left unsaid is how, in the name of profits, markets work to meet demand regardless of the nature or impact of that demand. Following the mantra of business is business, capitalists needn't ask whether their customers' desires for sparklers, rose petals, cigarettes, guns, drugs, or girls should be met, only whether their money is green. Also left unsaid is how businesses and their legions of ad agencies create and shape their customers' desires. Not for their customers' or society's sake, but for the sake of their bottom line. There is no end to what the market will supply as long as you have money. Champagne and caviar? Sure. Exotic animals? No problem. How about a 450-foot yacht that emits as much pollution in a single hour as the Volkswagen Jetta emits in 20 years? That too can be arranged for the tidy sum of $300 million. Under capitalism, the market determines anything's value. How much are people actually willing to pay for it? It speaks volumes about our capitalist society's priorities. This isn't capitalism's fault per se. It's our fault. But it speaks volumes about our capitalist society's priorities that by this criteria, we value movie stars over teachers, athletes over firemen, and pop singers over day caregivers, often by a factor of 100 or 1,000. Likewise, in 2009, when over 1 billion people were living in extreme poverty and over 20,000 children were dying each day from poverty-related causes, U.S. individuals spent a grand total of $8.9 billion on international aid. Sounds like a lot. That same year, they spent $380 billion on tobacco, $435 billion on alcohol, $300 billion on snacks, $2.6 trillion on dining out, and $2.7 trillion on entertainment. Insofar as capitalism permits and promotes such priorities, this too is reason to hate it. Part 6, private property, massive inequality, and incentives. Capitalism depends on a right to private property and wealth accumulation. There are powerful reasons to favor such notions, as the philosopher John Locke argued long ago. But Locke was defending a right to private property against arbitrary seizure by the king. And his notion of private property was restricted to whatever one mixed one's labor with. For example, one's home if one built it, or one's land if one tilled it. More importantly, Locke added a crucial proviso about property rights. Namely, that one only had a right to acquire personal property as long as there was enough and as good left in common for others. In other words, for Locke, the moral justification of private property depended on others being no worse off as a result of anyone's acquiring, accumulating, and disposing of their property as they saw fit. Unfortunately, under modern capitalism, private property has acquired a sacred status unmoored from its original roots and utterly divorced from the Lockean proviso that underlay its moral legitimacy. Today, people acquire, spend, and bequest vast sums that they haven't remotely mixed their labor with in Locke's sense. Moreover, they do so without even a pretense that enough and as good has best been left in common for others, and without regard to the effects on others. Thus, under capitalism, the wealthy, like kings of yore, can acquire prime real estate, even if it displaces those who live there. Similarly, pharmaceutical companies have powerful incentive to focus on diseases affecting the affluent and ignore diseases afflicting the poor. Not much money in that, even if the latter are much worse and far more widespread. Locke, I believe, would have hated these aspects of capitalism, and rightly so. Return to the case of Amazon. Amazon's founder, Jeff Bezos, has benefited millions of people. I think it perfectly appropriate that he be richly rewarded for this. But what is the justification for distributing Amazon's profits such that in 2018, Bezos was worth $131 billion? Why shouldn't more of the profits be distributed to Amazon's workers or the poor in China and elsewhere who actually produce the silk, flowers, and other items that customers purchased? It is often said that capitalism's vast inequalities are necessary to incentivize people to bring their talents to the market. Really? Does anyone seriously believe that Bezos wouldn't have invented Amazon if our economic system only allowed him to earn, say, $50 million? Or consider Bryce Harper's contract to play baseball for $330 million over 13 years. This example had just broken 2 days before I was supposed to give this lecture. Now it's a little stale. Since my back went out and I wasn't here last year when this happened. By capitalism's lights, Harper is worth every penny, since that's what the market bears. But does anyone really believe that Harper would have given up playing the game he loves if, say, he could only have earned maybe $3 million for playing baseball? Also, under capitalism, how many talented people lose their incentives to contribute to society, or never had such an incentive, thanks to having already made a fortune early or having inherited a large trust fund? I strongly support rewarding people for productively benefiting society. But massive inequalities are both unnecessary and counterproductive, I believe, in terms of the incentives they generate. This, too, is something to hate about capitalism. Part 7, conclusion. In the time allotted, I've barely scratched the surface of this important topic, and I haven't addressed ways of revising capitalism to avoid its problems. Perhaps we might pursue some of this during discussion. I end by paraphrasing Winston Churchill. In this talk, I've tried to give you a sense for why capitalism is the worst economic system yet devised, except for every other. Thank you very much.
Well, thanks to all of you for being here. I'm really glad to be back in Boulder. Every time, I've been here like 5 times in the past 2 years, so I think I get like a free t-shirt or something next time I show up. But every time I come here, I'm like, this place is so lovely, I wish I lived here. Thanks for Larry for doing this debate, if that's what we're doing with me. I knew you would say stuff that's incredibly interesting and provocative and smart. And the problem is that it's not going to be a real debate because I agree with like 94% of what you said, right? And that's what we're going to talk about today. And then I'll do the same thing. Like, what do I like about capitalism? What do I dislike about it? And I'll talk a little bit about what we could maybe do to make it work better. So I'm going to start by singing the praises of capitalism, but then I'm going to talk about the things that are happening right now that are making it not work as well as it could work for the people it needs to work for. So let's start by talking about in the abstract. What do we think about, what is capitalist ideology about? I don't know why I misspelled ideology, but there you go. I'm a bad proofreader. So one way of putting it is like the basic idea behind capitalism is let people do whatever the hell they want as long as they're not hitting each other. That's the basic idea, right? Permit all consensual trades. And it should be about trade, not war and empire. So if you haven't taken a class in the history of economics, you wouldn't know this, but Adam Smith's book, The Wealth of Nations, was written as an anti-imperialist book. That's what that book was about. He was writing at the beginning of the Age of Empire, and he said, of Europe, and he said, like, he, as a moral philosopher, rebelled against the idea of imperialism because he thought it was evil, but he wanted to appeal to people's self-interest. And he very carefully calculates how much money is England spending to maintain its empire, and how much is the value of the stuff it's stealing. And it turns out they're spending more money stealing than they're getting back. And the reason it happens is because the king and the people who make the guns and the people who make the warships, they benefit from it, and they spread the costs onto everyone else. In fact, you might not know this, but economics is called the dismal science not because economists talk constantly about scarcity. It's called the dismal science because it wasn't racist enough. Carlyle, the great author Carlyle in England, was complaining that all of these damn economists wanted to end the institution of slavery because they thought it wasn't efficient and we should just let people work freely instead. That's why it's called the dismal science, and that's where capitalist ideology comes from. Adam Smith, his big idea in The Wealth of Nations was that we should change the way we think about what counts as a wealthy nation. He's responding to people like Colbert and others they were saying like the way you decide a country is rich is by looking at the size of the king's treasury. And Smith instead says, no, what you need to do is look at the opportunities and the income and the life available to the typical person, and that's what The Wealth of Nations is. So that's capitalist ideology, but in practice it falls short of this. And why? So let's talk about some of the good things and talk about why it falls short. You can basically condense all of economic history into 2 sentences. So as Deirdre McCloskey, the great economist Deirdre McCloskey says, once upon a time, everyone everywhere was poor, and then capitalism happened, and now we're rich. And you can see it on this graph. This is GDP per capita worldwide, like going back to 1 AD. If you go back further, it looks like this. There were dark ages, there were occasional good, like golden ages, but basically throughout almost all of human history, up until the past 300 years, almost everyone worldwide lived on approximately $200 to $400 per person per year. Basically everyone was dirt poor. Everyone lived in extreme poverty until recently. And then there's this explosion of income where now, as we're speaking right now, GDP per capita worldwide is $16,600 in current dollars, which is commensurate with this. This is adjusted for inflation. People are the richest they've ever been. Of course, not everywhere. In some places they became very rich. In other places they became rich slower. So the nice thing is everybody got richer. Everyone's been getting richer over time, but some places got richer much faster than other places. Right, so if you're living in a place like the United States, you're living on an income that's something like 120 times more per day than the poorest people in the world. Right? So that's a bummer. This here is a map. It's produced by a Canadian thing called the Fraser Institute. Every year they hire a number of economists to rank countries around the world by how capitalist they are. The most capitalist countries are the blue countries. The least capitalist are the red. So Canada, the US, like Spain, we have Denmark up here, all of Scandinavia, like UK, Ireland, Australia. These are the most capitalist countries. They're also the places where people are the richest. The least capitalist countries are the ones in red, and they're the places where people are poor. You can get these scores year after year and see how they do. The nice thing is, even though income has been going up like at different rates around the world, as Larry pointed out, world poverty is disappearing before our eyes. And if you care about poverty, which I think you should, that's a wonderful thing. In the year 1800, 95% of the world lived on what we would now consider extreme poverty. Almost everyone was dirt poor. In the year 1800, things have gotten a bit better. About 75% of the world lived in extreme poverty. In the year 1960, things had gotten a little bit better. About 60% of the world lived in extreme poverty. In my lifetime, not thanks to me, but in my lifetime, it's disappeared. It's vanishing before our eyes. Now, this is an older graph, but this graph keeps going and is correct. Now, about 8% of the world lives in extreme poverty. Now, the people that are above that, a lot of them are still very poor, but they're richer than they've ever been. There's more people, and they're richer than they ever have been. That's a great thing. Nevertheless, it turns out that the places where people are richer are also the places where they are the most capitalist. This is a graph of looking at the Fraser income rankings, like how capitalist are you on a scale of 3.5 to 9.5, and GDP per capita. Of course, it's only showing averages, and of course there's big disparities in wealth inside of countries. So let's say you say, I only care about the very poor. There's this philosopher named John Rawls who thought we should allow for inequality, but make sure that it benefits the least advantaged group. That's what we should look at, is make sure we maximize the benefit to the least advantage. Well, it turns out in the quarter most free, most capitalist countries, the people at the 10th percentile of income in those countries receive about $11,000 per year in income before they get any welfare payments and before they get any government transfers. So if you're at the 10th percentile of income and you live in the most capitalist countries, you're already pretty rich by world standards. In fact, just to give you the number, if you are an American living alone at what the US considers the poverty line, you are in the top 15% of income earners in the world. And I'm adjusting for the cost of living. Top 15% of income earners in the world. So there are a lot of poor people, but the genuinely poor people are also people who are not in the capitalist countries. Now, people worry about capitalism and inequality, and there's ways in which capitalism has caused inequality. The countries that were capitalist became richer, And the countries that were less capitalist became poorer, and the gap widened. In the year 1800, the gap between the richest countries and the poorest countries was about 2 to 1. In the year 1960, it was like 50 to 1, it's much higher. It's now closing, which is a good thing. But still, there is that gap. By the way, that makes you upset about capitalism, the same point holds for democracy. The democratic countries got much richer, the non-democratic countries didn't. Right? Democracy caused inequality, but it caused it by making people better off. And I say as a person who wrote a book bashing democracy. In the United States, the poor are so rich by world standards that they have a lot of stuff. Stuff that people, even the middle class in the 1970s didn't have. So this is taken from the US Census Bureau. They have more recent data on this. But if you look at just Americans at the 10th percentile of income, this is what you find. 92% of them own a microwave, 81% of them own an air conditioner, 75% own a car or truck, most own a VCR. That number is going down because who the hell buys VCRs anymore, right? Most DVD players, that number is also going down because we don't really use those anymore. Video game systems and so on. These things are widespread. And these numbers are actually better than what was the middle class owned in the 1970s in the US, and significantly better than what the middle class owned in the 1950s. But that's just filthy lucre. Now, I love stuff. I love having filthy lucre. I love buying guitars and stuff like that. But not everyone, some people have higher aspirations and care about higher level values. Not me, but other people do, right? So what if you care about, what other things would you care about? What about freedom? What's the best kind of freedom of all? Just being alive. Well, it also turns out in these richer countries that people live longer. Like life expectancy has been going up. Your propensity, whether your kid will die during childbirth or make it to age 5, depends a great deal upon the income of the country that you live in. And of course, life expectancy for children is much higher in the richest countries than it is in the poorer countries. Right? Extreme poverty is very rare in the most capitalist countries. In the most capitalist countries, maybe about 2% of people could be living what we would consider extreme poverty. You walk outside of the most capitalist countries and you find extreme poverty rates jump up dramatically. It also turns out that the most capitalist countries do the best job protecting civil liberty and things like freedom of speech and freedom of religion, though just why that is so is hotly debated. You can take a class with me at Georgetown and we'll talk about that. It turns out further that this money, it doesn't buy you love perhaps, but it does buy you happiness. Around the world, people tend to, their standard of living and their income determines their level of happiness, though it tapers off after a certain point. And the richest countries are also the happier ones. It also turns out that money seems to buy us, well, maybe it goes the other way. The most capitalist countries are also the least corrupt countries. When you walk outside the most capitalist countries, those are the countries where you find governments are extracting resources for their own benefit at the expense of the people that they live under. Whereas in the more capitalist countries, governments have a stronger tendency to make sure that the institutions serve the interest of all. And so things like Transparency International's Corruption Perceptions Index, which measures the corruption of government, you find a strong negative correlation between how capitalist you are and how corrupt you are. Further, markets seem to make us nicer. I could tell you about a whole bunch of experiments on this. There's a number of economists who have gone around the world playing games with people for large sums of money, which test things like how generous people are, how kind they are, how likely they are to cheat during games, how likely they are to take advantage of strangers and so on. And it turns out the biggest cultural predictor that you will play fairly, play nicely, and act justly in these games is how market-oriented your society is. So it appears that markets are actually making us nicer rather than meaner. Beyond that, markets also give us more, not just time, but free time. If you're living in the United States in the year 1870, the United States is the 3rd richest country in the world in per capita income and the 3rd richest country ever to have existed. You would, on average, spend about 3,000 hours working for pay and about 2,000 hours working not for pay. If you're a typical adult, you'd start working around age 13 and you would retire when you drop dead. Right? And you spend something like 2/3 of your life awake and working. Now, because we're so much richer, the typical American is going to spend about 20% of their life awake and working, and they get the other 80% of their time to do other things, like play guitar or write poetry or watch sports or whatever else they might care about. Further, the most capitalist countries are also the countries that have the highest degree of gender equality. You step outside of the capitalist countries and gender equality tends to go away. Now keep in mind, these are the capitalist countries, the ones in blue. So Americans like to say stuff like, Sweden's really socialist and Denmark's really socialist and Canada's socialist, because they don't know what the word the socialist means. Those are very capitalist countries. In fact, when you measure particular things like their propensity to protect property rights, this is what you find. Like Sweden has much stronger protection for property rights than the United States does. Or in Europe and there's the world in general. Things like freedom from regulation. It turns out that like countries that we think of as like heavily interventionist, like Denmark and Sweden, it actually turns out that they're on par with the United States. Like this is the most recent data. The US became less regulated and moved up. But if I'd given the same talk 6 years ago, the US would have been ranked about number 18 in terms of economic freedom, and Sweden and Denmark and Finland were higher. So capitalism has a lot of good stuff going for it, but it also stinks in many ways. So now I'm going to talk about what's bad about it and what we might do about it. In real life capitalism, I work in DC, and the main thing we sell in DC is power. The people that I work, like who live near, my neighbors, they're a bunch of lobbyists. A lot of them are people who work in positions of power, and they sell favors to people. That's what they do. In real life capitalist countries, the rich often rig the rules toward their benefit at the expense of everyone else. Who's to blame for that? Who's to blame for the fact that the rules get rigged for the rich at the expense of the poor? I say we blame the 1%, and my good friend Bernie Sanders agrees. So I want to ask you, like, when you think about the 1%, what's your stereotype of them? What sort of pathologies do they tend to exhibit? Go ahead and answer. I'm asking, not rhetorically, go ahead and shout out some problems. What's wrong with the 1%? Don't worry, we won't tell them. You're not on camera. What's that?
Money hoarders.
Good, money hoarders.
They have like 4 houses and like 3 yachts or something.
All sorts of crap they don't need, right?
Lack of empathy.
Lack of empathy. They're not really concerned about the others, right? About the poor, right? What else? What else?
Orange hair.
Orange hair. A lot of them have orange hair. All right. Sorry if there's any orange hair people in the room. Yeah, no one is. Okay, we're good. Oh, not you though. What else? What's wrong with the 1%?
They're out of touch with reality.
They're just out of touch. What kind of reality are they out of touch with?
Middle class America, what it takes, to go to a grocery store, to take transportation.
Okay.
The basics.
Good. Anything else? All right. I'll add a couple things I want to bash the 1% too. Like, here's a problem. They're narrow-minded. They tend to be envious. They're greedy. They're unconcerned about the poor. They have a lot of NIMBYist attitudes. Like, I want stuff to happen, but not in my backyard, right? Have this school built, have this thing built, but not near me. I want it away from where I can't see it. And they do whatever it takes to maintain their status. I think that is all true. But here's the twist. I'm talking about you. And so are you. You're talking about you. You are the 1%. I'm not kidding. You are the 1%. Right? You can go to this thing called the Global Rich List, which uses data from the World Bank and Branko Milankovic, and you can type in your yearly income or your wealth, and it will tell you where you fit in the world. If you make $32,000 a year, you are in the top 1% of world income earners. Right? If you're making $16,000 a year, you're in the top 10%. It doesn't take that much. You are the 1%, and these behaviors, I think you exhibit. And I want to ask you to stop exhibiting them. Right? So here's what I mean by that. So here's Bernie Sanders, and he's a social democrat. Well, he's a democratic socialist, which is even more hardcore than a social democrat. And he talks a great game, and the game that he talks sounds so wonderful. He says, capitalism, we need to constrain it to make it serve the poor better. And I totally agree, and that's why I'm not going to vote for him. Because he's not going to do that. What he instead is going to do is make capitalism serve the rich at the expense of the poor. Here's what I mean. Bernie, I have an idea. We should open borders with the rest of the world. All the rich countries should allow poor people to move here if they want to. Just as I can move to Colorado at will and don't have to get anybody's permission, anyone in the world should be free to move to the United States, Canada, Switzerland, Japan, and so on. Should we do that, Bernie? Right, what would he say? This is what he says in response. If your point is open borders, my God, there's a lot of poverty in this world and people from all over. Oh, you don't want to let the poor people live here. What if I asked economists about that? What do economists say about open borders? They have a lot to say about it. I wrote a whole book on it, so I could spend hours and hours and hours talking about it, but I'll give you the summary. Every year, economists ask the question, what is the effect of immigration restrictions on income around the world? How does it do to our income? Basically, what a restriction on immigration is making it hard for someone like you to move somewhere else and take a job. There are poor people in places where their labor is not needed, and then there are places here where their labor could be very useful. What would happen if we were to allow open borders? The typical estimate in the vast economic literature on this is that opening borders around the world would double world product. Double world product. World product right now is about $128 trillion in PPP adjusted 2019 US dollars. In a world of open borders, it would be twice that. Now, some more conservative, the most conservative estimates in the literature say it's going to be about 50%. And we can talk about how they come up with these more conservative estimates. Further, most studies find, contrary to what the politicians say, contrary to what Bernie says, contrary to what Orange Hair Man says, they both say the same thing, and they're both wrong. Almost all these studies, when they study the effect of immigrants on domestic countries, say that almost everyone's income will go up. Rather than immigrants coming and taking your job and make your income go down, you'll actually make your income go up, with the exception of like manual labor men who have less than a high school diploma. The most pessimistic bit of literature on this says they'll see their incomes go down by about 10% for maybe about 20 years, and then they'll go back up too with efficiency gains. Glenn Whale has a recent paper on this, and he says, it turns out that allowing people to move wherever they want has a stronger effect on reducing income inequality than redistribution or anything else. Nevertheless, that's not what politicians talk about, and that's not what we vote for. We vote against the interest of the poor. Why? Because we want to maintain our vast welfare states. What is a social democratic welfare state? Well, to be frank, it's a system in which the very, very rich pay taxes, and those taxes, for the most part, actually provide benefits to you, to the person who's renting them. Like, I pay into Social Security. What am I doing when I pay into Social Security? I'm paying into my own retirement. I'm not getting a very good return. I'm getting like less than 1% return on Social Security. I get much higher than that on my 401k, but I'm paying for my own retirement. A lot of social insurance mechanisms are just me paying taxes to get some sort of benefit at the end. But there is some real distribution that takes place in actual social democracies, much less than they tell you. We're talking roughly about 4% of income in these richer countries that gets redistributed from the rich to the poor. That's a pretty good estimate. So not that much, but when you do redistribute it, whom are you redistributing it to? You're taking it from the very rich and giving it to the merely rich. And I want to be clear, if you are living at the poverty line, what's considered the poverty line in a rich capitalist country, you are rich. You are in the top 15% of income earners in the world. You enjoy a standard of living that's much better than most people around the world, and you're in the top 1% of people who've ever lived by far. So what do? They say, in order to have this system, our club, where we're going to redistribute income, we're going to keep all those genuinely poor people out. We can't let them come here and consume our welfare services and ride on our roads and live among us. So what is a social democracy but a system of like constraining the country for the benefit of the rich at the expense of the genuinely poor? By the way, someone like Bernie Sanders might say billionaires should not exist and we must wage a moral and political war against the growth. I'm not that good with my, I'm sorry, I'll try my best, but I'm not that good at imitations. Against the gross wealth and income inequality. Let's understand, we come together, we always win. That sounds great. We should get rid of the billionaires and help the poor. But here's the problem with that. You cannot solve the problem of world poverty by redistribution alone. It's simply arithmetically impossible. Here's how I know that. GDP per capita worldwide is $16,100 as of today, $16,100 to $16,600, depending on which estimate you look at. That means if I were to wave a magic wand, here it is, I wave my magic wand and I convert all production in the world into consumable income and I give it to every single person equally around the world, everyone gets $16,000. For most people in the world, that's a pretty good deal because that's more than they're getting. For you, you would be pretty bummed by that because it's probably less than you're getting if you're in this room. But for most people, that'd be pretty good. But this is a purely hypothetical thing. That's impossible. Not just because we don't know how to redistribute things equally, but because, like, I'm talking about all production. It's not like all production takes place in the form of consumable income. It doesn't. I mean, some of it's building roads. Some of it's putting money into making factories and making machines and things that produce income. So really, it's more like about half that. That's in principle transferable. So in principle, if I had perfect egalitarian redistribution right now, and I didn't destroy the capital, and I kept all the machines going, and I kept the governments going, maybe everyone in the world could get about $8,000. Now, if you're living in Burundi, that's still a windfall for you, but we're talking about everyone being poor. The poorest county in the United States makes significantly less than that. So what you really need is not just redistribution, you need growth. You need people to get much, much richer. And here's a dilemma we face. We don't always face it. I don't want to overstate this, but it's a dilemma we face, and it's a real bummer. It's a bummer because the world doesn't let us have everything we want at once. What I'd like to do is have everyone be more equal and everyone be richer, but we can't always do that. Certain forms of investment, certain kinds of redistribution, say providing K through 6 education, not only make people more equal, but make them richer at the same time. Other forms don't. Sometimes when we invest in certain kinds of in certain kinds of charity or certain kinds of redistribution, we slow down growth because we're not investing in the future. I mean, just as a cartoon example, if I have $100, I could, as I say, feed 10 homeless people with that right now. If I invested in a Dow Jones index fund and wait 50 years, it'll be worth about $3,000. I can then feed, say, 300 people or more with that. So what should I do? So here's a way of illustrating that. Imagine you have two countries, one called Growthtopia and one called Fairness Land. Fairness Land's a little bit more equal than Growthtopia. Its poor are much richer than the poor in Growthtopia in the year 2000. However, suppose their income grows by 4% a year, and their income only grows by 2% a year. After 26 years, it's better to be the poor in Growthtopia than it is to be in Fairness Land. However, at any given year, you could help the poor even more by redistributing income in that year. So I don't want to overstate this. Not all forms of redistribution hinder growth, but many do. And if we care about helping people, we have to consider that. We have to be clear about it. Another way to illustrate that is imagine that the United States in the year 1870 had decided to engage in certain policies which reduced our growth rate from 2% a year to about 1% a year. That's our GDP per capita has grown at 2% a year steadily since 1870. There's little blips here and there, but that's the average and it stays pretty close to the average. Imagine that we had decided to reduce growth in favor of certain other policies from 2% to 1%. If we did that, our standard of living right now would be the same as Egypt's. We'd be making about $13,000 a year. Over time, slow growth is really awful, but also over time, growth is really good. A few other points. I have lots of things to say, but in the interest of time, I'm going to get towards the end of here. We complain about things like outsourcing. Now, I think the complaints about outsourcing and how it affects Americans are overrated. But if you're an egalitarian, you shouldn't really be that bummed about it, because think about what happens. I have a bunch of guitar equipment. All right, I have an 5150 Eddie Van Halen brand amplifier, which was made in Vietnam. Right, it didn't cost that much. I also have a really fancy amplifier, a couple of really fancy amplifiers that are made in Petaluma, California, like my Mesa Boogie JP2C. That costs about $3,500, though I got a good deal on it and got it for $27. Right? Whereas the Vietnamese amplifier costs about $900. Now, if I stop buying things from Mesa Boogie and I start buying things from, just from Eddie Van Halen's brand, I'm outsourcing those jobs to Vietnam. And the rich, very, very rich people in Petaluma will be bummed. But what about I do for these people over here in Vietnam? If I care about alleviating poverty, it's much better that I buy from them than I buy from people in Petaluma or Bletchley or other places where they make amplifiers. And that's why, apparently I have, apparently I took that slide from a lecture I gave, or like a class where I had to narrate over it because of a snow day. But even Jeffrey Sachs, a very left-wing economist who favors transferring large amounts of money from the rich countries to the poor, says the following: "My concern is there's not too many, not that there are too many sweatshops, but that there are too few." Now, I've asked Bernie about this. He doesn't care. He says, since 2001, nearly 60,000 manufacturing plants in this country have been shut down, and we've lost over 4.7 million decent-paying jobs, and NAFTA has led to the loss of 700,000 jobs, et cetera, et cetera. Now, whether NAFTA's done all this is hotly disputed among economists left and right, and most of them aren't as pessimistic. But even if he were right, one thing you might say is, okay, well, that's rough. But what are we doing? If he's right about this, what we're doing is global capitalism over the past 60 years has at worst, been redistributing income and wealth from rich people in the top 20% of income earners to poor people, genuinely poor people living in genuine poverty. So if you're an egalitarian, you should be like, yes. Now, I'd love to go after the billionaires instead. I'd much rather redistribute from, Bezos to the poor than from, an average middle-class American to the poor. But keep in mind, we are still talking about helping the poor. So there's lots of other things we can say about things that we do that make capitalism work less for others, and I won't get into them. But at the end of the day, this is my basic worry about social democracy. I think there's a lot to be said for it being a kinder, gentler form of capitalism for the rich people who live in social democracies. I can see why, if you're already rich, you'd want to live in a more generous welfare state like Sweden than a less generous welfare state like the United States. Though, to be frank, we're not quite as ungenerous as you think. We only spend about $1,000 less per person in welfare than they do. We just distribute it kind of badly. But at the end of the day, what these systems are, what a social democracy is a system that helps the rich at the expense of the poor. It creates a fortress around the country to redistribute income among the rich and excludes the poor because they know that system isn't going to work with all of them coming in. If you care about the genuine poor, there's a lot to hate about this. And who's causing it? It's us. We're the 1%, and we have all of those pathologies that you said we do. So we should change. All right, so thank you. All right, do we want to just both come up here and take questions? Yeah, let's just do that.
Great.
All right, so we'll take your comments, questions. You can, please.
Why do you talk about redistribution when we're talking about education, healthcare, justice, housing, political utilities, infrastructure, public transportation?
Why talk about redistribution? Yeah, so you're right that for a lot of this stuff, public utilities for the roads and so on, it's not really redistribution, it's just a provision of a public good. Education is not, don't get mad when I say this, because I know what people are going to do this. When I say public education is not a public good. Public good is a technical term in economics. It refers to things that are not excludable and non-rivalrous. Education is very excludable and very rivalrous. It's easy to keep people out, and when you consume education, the more people consume it, the less they get. The more people in my classes, the less people get from individual interaction with me. And I work at Georgetown, we're awesome at excluding people. Right? We exclude like 9 out of 10 people who apply. So maybe the government should provide schooling, but it's not technically a public good. Even so, the government should pay for this is not the same thing as saying it's a public good. So education is partly redistributed and partly not. I pay a lot of property taxes, but I also send my kids to public school. I live in the DC area. We have the best public schools in the country. And so I'm in a sense paying into what I get back. But I also will end up paying over the course of my lifetime much more than I consume or my kids consume, and a lot of that money gets sent to relatively poor people who are not paying as much in taxes. So education has a partly redistributive element, but it's not purely redistributive. So I agree, your question's a very good one. It's more complicated than just pure redistribution.
Yeah, we're fielding, so sure.
Yeah.
I'm curious about the intersection of capitalism and climate change, because it seems to me that all the benefits of capitalism, I may be willing to accept them, but the biggest problem is that it's, coming head to head with our consumption levels being unsustainable. What do you have to say about that?
Well, just a couple of questions, quick comments. Before I directly answer, I just want to say one word about his talk. Unsurprisingly, actually, he says, if you're really an egalitarian, I am an egalitarian, you should agree with almost all these things I'm about to say, which he did, and I do. He's completely...
See, we agree on everything, yeah.
I'm sorry to say, if you go far enough to the left and far enough to the right, they merge in certain very scary ways. But we agree about most of those points. Now,
I'm very left-wing. Are you the right-wing guy?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Now, vis-a-vis your comment about what's the connection between climate change and capitalism and so on. Right. There's a question about growth, a legitimate question about growth, and what fuels growth, and biofuels fuel growth, and those contribute to climate change overwhelmingly. Now, that may just be a temporary thing. Temporary, it's still scary for the next 100 years, but the fear for the longest time was that we were going to run out of all these fuels, right? We're going to run out of them completely. Well, if we ran out of them, then we'd have to depend on something else, like wind, like solar, there's a lot of other possibilities at that point. Question is, will the Earth have been destroyed between now and then by the time we run out of it? The funny thing is, people always said, for very bad reasons, we're going to run out of all these things. And if the reality is we haven't run out, and we're not going to run out in the near future, and that may be actually the problem. Not that we are going to run out, but that we're not. Now, there's another question, though, that's about, and this was relevant to one of the points that Jason was making. So I agree that if you have growth, lots of growth, that will be good in the long run for even the poor. And if you try to pull back on that growth, that will be bad in the long run for even the poor. This is directly relevant to the issue of climate change, too. There's a question of who's the winners and who's the losers. So suppose you want to do something about climate change. There's a lot of good reasons to want to do something about climate change, including many of the reasons that Jason was talking about. Cuts both ways, actually, but I'm just going to say a lot of good reasons to worry about. But what you're in essence doing is there's been this massive growth, all this progress on 100 million fronts in the world. And most of that progress has taken place in two countries, China and India. China and India have had extraordinary growth patterns over the last 20 years, 40 years, 20 years really. And those, I mean, they're not sustainable. But those growth patterns have benefited the poor in China and India. So when people talk about climate change and they talk about, you know, all these terrible things that are happening in the climate, the real question is, who is the main beneficiary of that? And overwhelmingly on the global scene, the main beneficiary of that were the poor in China and the poor in India. Billions of people have benefited from that. Now, someone says, who's going to pay the cost and who's going to benefit? Who's going to pay for the cost if we try to stop climate change right now? And I'm not saying there aren't good reasons to do it. Are not actually going to be you and me, overwhelmingly. It's going to be the poorest people in China and India. And who are going to benefit from that? The poorest people in the future, in the next 50 and 100 years. And predictably, for reasons Jason has hinted at, and that we all know, technological growth, human capital, and so on, the poorest people in 50 years are going to be much better off than most of us in this room today. And so there is I mean, you're absolutely right, there's a connection between growth and climate change. There's also a question about, if you want to do something about climate change, who's going to win and who's going to lose? And you might say it's the future that's going to lose if, you know, there's all these terrible things. But losing is relative. They're going to lose relative to another future where there wasn't all those kinds of problems. They'll still be much better off than we are today. And the poor in the future are going to be much, much better off than the poor today. So a lot of policies that one might go in for in order to reduce climate change, which will also cut back growth, will in essence be redistributing resources from today's poor in China and India to the future poor in China and India and elsewhere, who will be much better off. From an egalitarian standpoint, it's not clear that that's a good idea. One more comment on that. I happen to agree completely that if we could get you and me, all the people in this room, to bear the cost of changing policies for climate change, then we should do that. Absolutely. And there's powerful reasons to do that from 100 perspectives, egalitarian and growth standpoint, utilitarian, a ton of reasons. But I think my own fear is that in the actual world as it exists today, we're not going to be the ones bearing the cost. The ones that are going to bear the cost, if we have effective controls, which I am still partly in favor of because it's a very complex issue, but are going to be the world's poor. Oh, well, why don't we alternate calling people?
Way in the back.
Right.
Professor Temkin, you touched on this a little bit in that last answer, but in regards to like the debate between who has the superior economic model between America and China.
Yeah.
The Chinese, by a lot of metrics in the past 50 years, have been more successful in economic growth and pulling more people out of poverty.
Yeah.
So if we put aside like all of the political and individual freedoms that we have and like the value of those that we have in America that people in China don't have, like, how would you respond to someone who is arguing that the Chinese model that's like state-run capitalism kind of is superior to just the capitalism that we have in the Western world, in America?
Actually, I'm glad you addressed that to me. Jason's in a much better position to respond to that particular question than I am, but I'll just take a quick stab and then let him jump in. The reality is most of the gains that have taken place in China have been as a result of their adopted capitalism. I mean, you could call it state-run capitalism, but it's a form of capitalism. That's where the great jumps have taken place in China. And that has benefited China a tremendous extent. Now, what is true is that, you know, they have their own problems of corruption and various other kinds of things. Who are the beneficiaries there versus who are the beneficiaries here of the forms of capitalism that they do? And it's a tricky question. I mean, overwhelmingly in our country, the beneficiaries are the super, super rich. We all benefit as well, but they benefit to a greater extent. In China, the main beneficiaries of allowing capitalism to run its course in a certain way have been very politically powerful people and their cronies, who they put in control of the companies that are generating these vast kinds of things. Lots of people in China have benefited from it, but in terms of, it's not necessarily the captains of industry, it's the well-connected, although one must say in this country, the captains of industry and the well-connected seem not to be really separable
Yeah, thanks. I'd agree with that. The thing about China, there's this thing in economics called the production possibility frontier, and you have to imagine this is all possible things we can build, and this is like if we're maximally producing, we're on this curve somewhere, and all possible points in this curve are equally good, right? China is benefiting from something called catch-up growth. They have resources, they have people, but they had a terribly illiberal system. They were very inefficient. They're back here. Like in 1990, like in 1989, or when like they were like Deng Xiaoping is like, I just want the communists to stay in power. I don't really care about communism per se, and he starts liberalizing the economy. They're back here, and it's very easy to go from here to here. You can get 10% growth rates per year. And countries that are poor, that have like badly managed economies with bad institutions, when they start to liberalize and adopt the institutions that work elsewhere, they often get these like 10% like growth per year. The United States, the Netherlands, countries that are rich, they're at this thing called the frontier. And growing from there, you have to push the frontier out, takes massive intellectual change, innovation, and so on. It's much harder to get. That's why countries like the countries that got rich first, they never had 10% growth. It was always like 2% growth, 3% growth. It's the countries that are catching up that get this massive growth. And you can even model that out. In one of my books, I have a thing where I imagine that we meet the Vulcans and they're literally better at everything compared to us, and we start trading with them. And you can show that they would have pretty good gains from that, but we'd have massive gains almost overnight just by interacting with them. So I don't think China has a better model. I think it's growing faster because it's a latecomer, which is also true of South Korea. It went from poor to rich in like a 30-year period. The period that took 90 years for the US to do, it took like 30 years. Japan took about 50 years. They're getting rich faster because they're coming set less, not because they have a better model.
I just want to add one more comment to that, and then there's something else also not to be sniffed at lightly, which Bao was acutely aware of, which is the power of numbers. He was thinking about this in a slightly different way, but if one looks at the world and says, what's the most important resource, right? And you start thinking, what are the great resources? Oil, that's really important. Coal, that's really important. Uranium, titanium, there's all these special things that we use in our cell phones right now. These are really, really super valuable, important resources. Almost everybody agrees the most important resource is the human resource, really just human beings. And every human being carries with them the potential for growth in a variety of ways. If you on-chain, 1 billion human beings, you give them education, a gazillion things are possible. Right? A lot is possible. Sheer numbers says, in addition to the point that was being made here, sheer numbers says that China and India have a tremendous advantage over all the rest of us in just the number of people they have. Assume that the people in China and India have the same proportion of super smart people as we do here, right? Let's say that's 5% of the population here, that's the super smart people. The 5% of the people who are super smart in China is equal to our entire population. That's the numbers, the entire population. So in addition to talking about competing economic systems and political systems and something else, they just have something else going for them. They have human capital at work on a massive scale. It's held back for a long time for a variety of reasons. But once that's opened up, they have the possibility of growth forward that's really in a way separate from this question of economic systems and all these other kinds of things. Yeah.
First of all, is the direction.
Sure.
5% of the population of China is a lot less than the population of the US.
Okay, that's question. Whatever it is.
7 million, it's a lot less. But anyway,
So make
the point is taken.
Okay.
Yeah.
10%, whatever the number is. It's a lot of people.
More like 20%, yeah. But anyway, I want to get back to what you said about climate change. You said something sort of interesting, which is that we don't do anything about climate change now. In 50 years' time, so if we do something about climate change now, then the beneficiaries will be the poor in 50 years' time. The poor in 50 years' time will be better off than like all of us now. Whereas if we don't do anything about climate change, then that would sort of benefit the poor now. This seems to assume that the future will be like the past, right? And it seems to assume the kinds of curves that Jason was putting up there in terms of growth.
Yeah.
But are we entitled to assume that, given the predictions of what climate change is going to do if unchecked? Are we entitled to assume that if we don't check climate change, things will continue to grow? Are we entitled to assume that, I mean, what I've read, and you know, Ben is better versed in this, that the places that are predicted to be most affected by climate change, it's not just that it'll be so uncomfortable people, will absolutely devastate. I mean, there'll be massive areas. I mean, look, the poor people in Miami,
Yeah.
you know, they'll be underwater. I mean, you know, heaven forbid. But no, seriously, I mean, in other parts of the world. So, I mean, is there a reason to assume that we can just, you know, keep these predictions? I mean, Garrett Hardin made this mistake in you know, his well-known stupid paper in which he assumed that the population would continue to grow no matter what we did, and all we do by helping others is, you know, incentivize them to keep reproducing. And as everybody knows, and as Jason actually, you know, pointed out, population comes down when education goes up, and Hardin was completely ignoring these things. So are we entitled to assume that growth will keep going even if we don't do anything about climate change?
He's going to jump in. But yes, go on.
Yeah, I think it's hard to prove it now. I have to like show you, but when economists write about this, I might be wrong, but for instance, like the person who won the Nobel laureate in economics 2 years, like not this year, but the year before, William Nordhaus, won it for working on the economics of climate disasters. And he works very carefully on this, and he worries about these very questions, and he talks about what's our evidence of the disasters and where production is taking place and how we'll slow down production, how production will have to be reallocated, what farmland is going to come on board that wasn't arable before, what are we going to lose. He's trying his best to be really careful about looking at all these things. And then, even then he says, all right, if there's unchecked climate change, which our best estimate is a 3 degree Celsius change over the next 100 years, then you know, the total world product will go down by, I'm overestimating, actually says it's about 3%, but it's really maybe about 5%. Mm-hmm. But then with a 2.5% growth rate, which is his most conservative estimate of world growth, that means that we're talking about, as you pointed out, a world where world product is 450 trillion. It would have been 500 trillion, but now it's only 450 trillion. And the average person has a standard of living much higher than that of Canada right now, and the poor are living a standard of living that's much better than like most people. That's Nordhaus. Now, some people think he's overly optimistic, but the Stern report, which tries to use the same methods and still worries about the things you're talking about, he thinks it's going to be like about 20%, but still much richer. But it's worth noting that even if they're wrong, the people who are working on this and trying to come up with these estimates, they're very carefully taking your point into consideration.
Is this because I mean, so one of the reasons that I find this really hard to believe, but you're the expert, I'm not the expert.
I'm just mentioning an expert, I'm not an expert.
I mean, given the predictions of you know, huge swathes of the land that will become completely uninhabitable, I mean, is it simply because there'll be complete, you know, whoever will be the poor in 50 years' time will be very different. I mean, obviously, you know, as we all know, they're not dead population.
Sure, we're not.
But even, you know, in terms of like sort of where they live or whatever, I mean, so a bunch of Russians will benefit because all of a sudden Siberia will be you know, a paradise. But so a bunch of people they'll die out. So they'll move. So they'll move. Be better off in 50 years' time because, you know, there's a bunch of people who'll be dead because of climate change.
Yeah, so these are world averages, and when I wrote that book, the In Defense of Openness book, like the last chapter is on climate change, and I think this actually gives us an additional reason to be in favor of immigration because the effects of climate change are differential. Canada will benefit on net, probably. Yeah. Russia will benefit on net. The U.S. will lose on net. The countries around the equator, which are already very poor, will be hurt on net by a lot. So this is another reason why, I mean, it'd be great if we can mitigate climate change. I'm in favor of things and to do that, but it's another reason to say we need to let people move away from the equator to the places that are going to be better off, which will, and for what it's worth, when they model this stuff, they don't model mass migration. So if mass migration happens, then actually the overall economic damage would go down and the productivity will go up.
Because the population will still just be in different parts of the world.
Yeah, the people moving to places where their situation is better, they can be more productive, they have less harm. Yeah, I mean, Bangladesh is screwed and Canada is going to be benefited, so we need to let people get out of Bangladesh. Even if we kill all, like wipe human beings out, like just make them disappear from the face of the earth, climate change is still going to happen at this point. And Bangladesh is going to be pretty badly off in 50 years, just from the stuff we've already pumped in the atmosphere. So, yeah, we're going to get people out of Bangladesh. That's the best we can do, I guess.
So I just want to add a tiny bit. There's a gazillion things to say about this in a very short time. And I'm not a climate skeptic. I'm not a climate change skeptic. So there are people who say, oh, climate change is never going to happen. No, I think it's happening. I have no doubt it's happening. I trust the scientists on this. They know what they're saying. The question is, who benefits, who loses, what's the impact, and so on. And I just want to remind you of two things. You can go back through the history of humanity, and every century there are these claims about how the sky is falling. This is the one. I know everyone said it was bad in the past, but this is the real one. And you can go back century after century after century. It's always been true in human history. You could go back to the 1800s and everyone said we're running out of wood. We're not going to be able to have ships anymore. Well, it turns out that we could create things like iron, and who would have thought that you could actually fly airplanes with iron or steel or various other things, or go on ocean liners not in wood things. It turned out that we could do that. But people thought we're going to destroy all the trees, there won't be any more trees, and then all this stuff, and then it turns out, and this just happens again and again and again. I was raised in an era where I read all these books. I mean, all these books of zero population growth, limits to growth, population bomb, and so on. And I completely bought all of this. I mean, just 100%. The world was coming to an end. Any of you who are my age who read all those books, I mean, these were really scary books. But they made predictions. They made firm predictions. And they said in no uncertain terms, each of these books, that by the year 2000, and then these doomsday scenarios were trotted out by each of these very famous people, Paul Ehrlich and others, Nobel laureate and so on. And none of those predictions turned out to be true, none of them. And there's a very famous debate, I just commend it to you for those of you guys who might want to look at this, between the so-called boomsters and the doomsters. And it was an economist at Maryland, I think at the time, Simon, who was debating Ehrlich. Ehrlich was going on Johnny Carson saying, by the year 2000, overpopulation, it's all coming to an end. We're using up all our resources and so on. And Simon listened to this and listened to this. And he said, look, I have a suggestion for you. You take all your brilliant friends, and why don't we make a bet? And here's the form of the bet. It's an economic bet. We're going to bet, I think it was $1,000 or $10,000. I forget what the amount was. $10,000. So we're going to bet $10,000. In 10 years, we'll let the economics dictate whether something's scarce or not. You say we're running out of all these really scarce goods. You can pick a bundle, you and your friends, your brilliant friends at MIT and Caltech, get them all together. Pick the bundle of 10 items that you think we're running out of. I predict that 10 years, the basket of those items will be cheaper than it is today. To say that it's cheaper means economically we either don't need it anymore because we've got something else to take its place, or it's become easier to mine or easier to get or something else. So if we're running out of all this and it's still important to us, prices will be up because of supply and demand. But if it's not important to us anymore because we have other things that do a better job, or we're not running out because we have new ways of creating this stuff, prices will go down. You put together your bundle of 10 goods. I tell you at the end of 10 years, the cost of that bundle, you can pick any 10 resources in the world you want, will be cheaper than it is today. Ehrlich thought this was a fool's bet, that he had no problem. He got together with all his friends. They picked 10 things. 9 of them went down. Only one of them went up, and the only one that went up happened to be up because it was a particular mineral that was taking place in a country that had a civil war going on at the time, so it was hard to access that. And the net of that bundle was way lower. So I don't think there's a lot of evidence to side historically with doomsters. That doesn't mean disbelieve the science. That doesn't mean put your head in that sand. That doesn't mean, everything always works out well no matter what we do. Now, I'm not saying any of those things. But if you say is there a good reason to believe, yeah, I think the history of humanity tells you there's a pretty good reason.
Yes. Yes, you.
I had a question about your point on corruption, and that your graph showed that the most capitalist countries seem to have the least amount of corruption. And then I was kind of wondering about how exactly you define that, and also why, how exactly you link always capitalism to corruption. Because I was worried maybe that it might be too simplified. Because I was thinking about how exactly would you untangle it from, say, legacies of colonialism and imperialism from those richest countries? And then also, maybe more specifically with the U.S. like being involved in, say, like coups or meddling in other countries' politics and things like that, because we've gotten a lot of backfire from, like, say, Latin American countries for being involved with their politics in ways that may not actually benefit the people there, and some people say that that has led to corrupt government.
Yeah, very good. Really good question. So the Transparency International does this, attempts to do this kind of perception of how corrupt countries are, and there's a whole technique of how they do that, and it's questionable how accurate it is, and it's like the best measurement we have, but it's not a very good measurement. It's not like I can just measure your height, right? I wanted to. There's also like indices of how much rent seeking takes place, which is internal manipulation of rules for selfish benefit, but they're pretty spotty and they only rank a few countries, so we don't have these really great measurements. You're right that, like, I'm certainly not here to excuse U.S. behavior. Like, I write, a lot of my stuff is written about like what's wrong with that stuff, so I agree with you on that. The stuff you said about institutions, it seems like it almost goes the other way. And perhaps like the best popular book to read about this is called Why Nations Fail by Darren Achimolu and Robinson. And it's all about why are some countries rich and why are poor, and how do institutions affect this. And they say that it's probably more that in what they call inclusive economies, which are usually democratic and capitalistic, you spread out power sufficiently that like everyone kind of participates, the rules are sort of for everybody's benefit, and everyone gets enriched. And then there are what they call extractive countries, which are usually authoritarian and non-capitalist. And these guys aren't hardcore libertarians or something, they're just like moderate Democrats, I guess. And there you have those systems that are set up in favor of like the people who control the government at the expense of everybody else. What the interesting thing is, like Robinson, Achimolu, and Johnson wrote this famous paper in 2005 about the history of colonialism. And what they did was they looked at the kinds of colonies the European powers set up around the world and the effects on life today. So they said some European colony, sometimes they created a colony, they created it for the purpose of exporting their people and living there. And they would then export their institutions, like the rule of law and democracy and other things. And it's those places where colonialism, that kind of colonialism took place, are now very rich. Now keep in mind, they're not saying, it was worth it, we're glad we did it, because you're murdering people and so on. But they're saying the people who are alive today are better off because of that colonialism, because they have better institutions than they probably would have according to a baseline. They become richer than a hypothetical baseline where they've never been conquered. Again, not excusing conquering. It's not what they're doing. So that might be places like Hong Kong or Singapore or the US, where Britain exported its reliable rule of law based institutions. Other countries, such as Spain, they mostly put in what they called extractive empires, where the goal was just put in power, take as much stuff as possible, and don't worry about the living conditions of the people there. And then when Spain left, it left that same infrastructure over, and it was taken over by local elites and local warlords who just maintained those same institutions. So they say that when you measure like the degree of inclusivity or extractiveness, that's the word I'm looking for, and you look at countries today, you do find that yes, past colonialism doesn't explain why Europe is rich, but it does explain why some countries today are as poor as they are, because they have the legacy of European imperialism and those same bad institutions are left over. So yeah, I agree with you.
And can I just add one sentence?
Sure,
and then we'll end on that. And I'm happy to stick around for a bit if people want to come up afterwards, but we'll officially end so people can leave if they want. I think it's a really great question. There is little doubt that there is a correlation of the sort described between corruption and the riches, the wealth of a country. You know, between capitalism and between democracy tend to be less corrupt than these others. But the question you raise is a really good one, and I was hinting at this in my own way in discussing the so-called resource curse and the principle of effectiveness. Forget about what we did in the past and the legacy of that. I mean, not because it doesn't matter, but even without that, we have a current international system in place which encourages despots to come to power in these countries and rewards them. If you can take control of a country's resources, you can sell them off for your profit. So unfortunately, the international order as it exists now, which is largely dominated by capitalism, for good and for bad, has principles within the economic system advocated by things like the World Trade Organization and International Monetary Fund and so on, that allow this kind of a principle to be in place. So we do encourage that kind of corruption in those countries by our economic policies. Even if our country, we keep our hands clean, we don't have to be so corrupt. But we are the beneficiaries of the corruption, and we encourage it through our economic system. That's a great question.
I'd like to thank our speakers, and then if you'd like to talk to them after a bit, let's thank them.
Well done. That was great.
That was great, yeah.